Welcome to the Assembling Inclusion podcast. On this show, we feature different programs, individuals, and initiatives focused on being more inclusive of individual needs. We invite you to learn right alongside us. If you want some additional resources or access to our courses, please visit our website or follow us on social media. But for right now, let's get right to the episode. Coming up next on the Assembling Inclusion podcast.
We get kind of slotted into these expectations for the kind of person we are and the kind of life that we live. And so storytelling gives everyone an opportunity to decide what aspect of myself is it important for me to share with other people, and how do I want to do that?
Last week, I talked to Deetra Mitchell from Salute, Self-Advocacy's Lucas Toledo. In our conversation, she shared a little about the storytelling workshop that Salute members participated in during the past year. When I was researching for that interview, I actually had listened to a few of the storytelling videos from the workshop and was drawn to each individual's story, voice, and perspective. So I decided to reach out to Dr. Becca Monteleone, who facilitated those sessions with Salute. In our discussion today, we talk about her background, storytelling as a vehicle for self-advocacy, and the benefits of these types of workshops and experiences for both the writers and the listeners. So let's dive right in.
All right, welcome back to the Assembly and Inclusion podcast. I'm here today with Dr. Becca Monteleone, an assistant professor of disability studies at the University of Toledo. So Becca, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
So just to start us off, would you mind telling us a little bit about you and your background?
Absolutely. So as you said, I'm an assistant professor of disability studies at the University of Toledo. For people who aren't familiar with what disability studies is, we are really focused on disability as a social idea, as a political idea, as a cultural idea. So really moving beyond this understanding of disability as just something that is medical or so forth. And so we think about disability rights, disability history, access, and inclusion. So that makes sense for the context of this podcast. And a lot of my personal research and teaching centers around who gets to talk about disability and who doesn't, who gets taken seriously as an expert of disability, which is often not disabled people themselves, right? Often it's doctors or parents or service providers, et cetera. And then in addition to that, sort of outside of my academic work, I have been involved with inclusive arts communities for most of my life. Most recently, I was with Detour Company Theater in Scottsdale, Arizona. It's a theater company composed of artists with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I worked there as a director of theatrical productions, but also as an instructor for courses for things like storytelling, which we'll talk more about today.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. I love the point that you had made regarding your research about like who gets to talk. I mean, I always try to acknowledge like I enjoy talking about inclusion initiatives and it's great to hear about them, but I feel like with every interview, I'm learning something else, which is what I'm hoping the listeners are as well, taking something away from it. But like, no way do I ever feel like an expert in anything with disability or inclusion. It's always great to continue to learn. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about how you're using storytelling to have people share their own experiences through their own voice. So would you mind telling us about your work specifically with storytelling? Like, how did you get started with that?
Like I mentioned, I've done a lot of work in theater and inclusive and accessible theater. And so in part, my interest in storytelling comes out of that experience. I have taught classes in things like playwriting and improvisation and so forth, which really have some of the key elements of storytelling. But I really started seriously thinking about storytelling as a mode of self-advocacy or as a way for people with disabilities to reclaim their stories in about 2020, 2019. In 2020, I partnered with a journalist called Amy Silverman, who was working with the investigative newsroom ProPublica and the Arizona Daily Star. And we partnered on a storytelling event that paired with an investigative series that they were doing on disability services. And so this was one of the first times that I really started thinking about storytelling as a mode of reclaiming, like you're talking about, reclaiming some of that expertise over disability.
So I know this past year you worked with the Self-Advocacy Lucas Toledo group, who we in our previous episode spoke to about their work and what they were doing, but I wanted to touch a little bit more on the storytelling element, how you worked with them. So it was an 8-week workshop, correct?
It ran for 8 weeks. We met for 6 of those weeks.
How was that workshop structured? What did the sessions look like?
I have done these storytelling workshops a half dozen times now. And so I have a curriculum that I developed a few years ago that I generally use as my template for these kinds of storytelling events. So typically we're meeting once a week for an hour and a half, 2 hours. My emphasis is really on collaboration here, right? So the beginning of these workshops is let's talk about what storytelling is, what it means to tell stories that are based on our own lives, why it's important to do that. And then let's collaboratively come up with what is a theme that we want to talk around or share memories around or share stories around. And then from there, each of the sessions focuses on kind of a different aspect of storytelling. What is conflict? What is resolution? How do we do description? How do we do dialogue in storytelling? What does it mean to perform a story versus just speaking it? These kinds of practical stage skills, while at the same time, we're developing that final performance story based around whatever memory people choose. Then typically I record those iterations of those stories as we're telling them in the workshop. That becomes the basis of a script that they will then use for the storytelling event. Some people like to read it. Some people like to improvise when they're telling their story. I've worked with people who prefer that I ask them questions about their story and they answer them, and that's what the performance looks like. Some people do kind of embodied stuff where they're doing movements related to their story. Just like each story is really different, each performance looks very different too.
I didn't realize that they could take so many different forms. I kind of just thought like standing up and basically telling your story and what happened, or embedding some kind of theatrical elements into it. But I like that there's a variety in the options that they could choose from, because that really connects back down to the fact that now they can choose what feels most appropriate for not only their story, but for themselves and their own comfort levels.
I see storytelling as existing somewhere between like theater and self-advocacy. And so we have these theatrical elements embedded in the stories, but also, of course, it's a story about someone's life. And I think that we often expect people, particularly people with intellectual disabilities, to only appear in certain kinds of stories, playing certain kinds of roles, right? These inspirational stories that I'm sure your listeners are very familiar with, or kind of tragic stories about disability. And these are really stories that are almost always for a non-disabled audience. But with theatrical storytelling, in addition to people picking the mode with which they want to tell that story, they also get to pick what the story is about. What piece of your life is important for you to share with other people? And I feel like many of us don't get that opportunity. We get kind of slotted into these expectations for the kind of person we are and the kind of life that we live. And so storytelling gives everyone an opportunity to decide, what aspect of myself is it important for me to share with other people? And how do I want to do that? And I think that's really powerful.
I could definitely see that. I have a background as a special ed English teacher. That's where I was for the first part of my career. So as you're talking about the storytelling, I'm like thinking, oh, I wish I was back in the classroom, because it would have been something that would have been so powerful, I think, for my students to be able to take ownership of their story. And I think you're right. There is a lot of putting people in certain categories, but allowing them to decide what they want to share with the world. That would be really powerful. And at the end, there was a culminating experience, you had said, right, where they all kind of come together and they shared their stories in like a singular location for an event.
Yes, so we had a final event. It was a public event at the Toledo Lucas County Public Library in this very beautiful performance space. It was open to the public. The theme that we had collaboratively decided on for this workshop was the idea of growing and changing. And so we ended up having 11 storytellers telling 10 stories, because 2 storytellers told a story together, which I'm happy to explain what some of those stories looked like. And this idea of growing and changing, it means so many different things to so many different people. We had a story about conquering your fears and going to a haunted house for the first time. And then another storyteller told a story about how she had lost her job in the mid 80s because of her disability, but then, talking about what the next 30 years looked like for her and building her sense of pride and confidence in who she is. We had, as I mentioned, two storytellers told a story together about how they began the relationship that they're in now, which kind of culminated in this really wonderful message directly to the audience that everyone deserves to have a good, healthy relationship and can wait for that or not settle for something that isn't healthy. We had a story about someone talking about the moment where they had to stand up to their parents who were acting not as guardians, but as people kind of oversaw aspects of their lives, stand up to her parents to move in with her long-term boyfriend. And then we had someone tell a story about the first time they ever rode in a helicopter. So this whole kind of range of stories that all have to do with this idea of change, these pivotal moments. The way that we had talked about it in the workshop was like, what's a moment in your life that you remember kind of a before and an after? What was the pivot for you? And you get all sorts of different responses to that, which I think culminates to a really fun event.
That's really nice. There's such a wide range of stories being told. Earlier, you had mentioned like you kind of always hear the inspirational stories, but it's nice to just kind of hear just any story that the person feels was impactful in their lives. And I love that there was even a partnership for two people telling one story. That's a really nice way to bring the message together as well. I think that must have been really powerful to see. I feel like when I was talking to and researching for my interview with Salute, I feel like I saw that their county had posted some of the videos of some of the storytelling, which I'll make sure to link in the show notes so everyone can kind of take a look and see. I started to watch some of them a little bit, and it was really nice to see all the stories that came out of this experience.
Yeah, I mean, if we're thinking about access, right, we're thinking also about the audience having access. And so one of the reasons that we decided to film all of these stories and post them separately is, of course, we're still living in a world where not everyone is able to come to a public event at a large public gathering. And so having those live on through those recordings, I think, is just another way in which we're inviting in lots of different kinds of audiences.
And even like the global perspective too, right? Somebody might come across that video, they can resonate with it, even if they're not locally in the area and couldn't attend something like that, they can still hear and listen to those stories and make a connection with them, which is really a great goal. So based on your experiences so far, how do you think that this storytelling workshop or other ones that you've done have been beneficial for both the participants and for the individuals who have attended and watched and listened to the stories?
I think this is a good question. And I think it comes back to some of the things that we've already discussed. There's a lot of misconceptions that exist about disabled people, particularly about people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I think one of the biggest misconceptions that exists about intellectual disability is that people with intellectual disabilities can't express themselves. And so because of that, you get a lot of other people jumping in and being like, I'll do it for you. I'll be your voice. I'll take care of it, right? I'll speak up for you. And what that does often is it limits the opportunities that people have to share their own experiences, to claim their own expertise over their own lives. While I think that the non-disabled people who do that are very well-meaning, they're in some ways perpetuating this idea that there needs to be somebody else who's stepping in and acting as that voice or acting as that advocacy. Because of that, I think that the perspectives of people with intellectual disabilities get written out of their own narratives, written out of their own lives in some ways. Storytelling is a way, and this benefits everybody involved, the storytellers and audience members. It's a way to take back that narrative. It's a way to push back against this ableist misconception about what disabled people are and are not able to do.
I think that's a great point. And I could definitely see how that really is something that would benefit both parties in totally different ways. I've seen that a lot as an educator, even just in like IEP meetings and things like that, people trying to speak for the student. And it's like, no, what do you want? Like, this is you, this is your document. It's not mine, it's not your parents, it's yours. What do you want? I think that's a really important point, to be able to have them own their voice and their story and their narrative. So you had said you facilitated workshops like this a handful of times. So I'm assuming there's plans to continue this type of storytelling work in the future?
I actually just started another storytelling workshop with a different set of folks last week. So yes. And then with Salute, we have been invited to another performance in the fall. And so hopefully we'll be running another workshop prior to that. The thing that I've learned through these experiences of running these workshops is that there's a huge demand for it. Right? There aren't a ton of opportunities like this that exist in a lot of different places. Maybe the thing that I would say to anyone who's listening out there is that this is a totally doable thing, right? I would encourage anybody. It's a really kind of low resource activity. It doesn't require a ton of funds. It doesn't require a ton of time, really. This is 2 months, 2 hours a week for 2 months. The space can be donated, particularly if you're looking for like a public venue. Things like your public library or your public parks are great places to do this. I think it's a really doable action that I would encourage a lot of people to think seriously about. Is this something that I'm able to do in my community? I certainly will be continuing to do this. I'll certainly be evangelizing about it so that other people hopefully take it up too. The curriculum that I developed around storytelling is available online. And so I am happy to share that link too. It's for a 6-week version of this kind of storytelling workshop. And so if anybody is interested in taking this on themselves, I would really encourage you to do so.
That would be great. I'm just thinking and I always come at it from the perspective of, like, could I take this and put this into a classroom? And I definitely think that, especially with the curriculum resource, that's something that I could see a lot of teachers wanting to bring into their classrooms to give their students their voices back. I taught middle school, so I think that's even just getting them started that young to start to talk about their experiences and things like that and give them the channels to do so.
I just wanted to mention, when I wrote the curriculum, I tried to build in some flexibility in it. I wrote, you could stretch this out over a semester, over an academic year, do 15 minutes a day. It's pretty endlessly adaptable for however you might want to use it, right?
Which is great, because then it makes it a lot more accessible with that flexibility built in. Like, there are so many options that people can take based on their scheduling and different circumstances. And I think that's really amazing that you put that out there for people to be able to use within their own communities. My last question was, what advice would you have for someone who wanted to implement this type of storytelling work with their community or different organizations of people that they're working with? I know you kind of touched on it, but is there any other advice recommendations that you would give them?
I think that I would not be intimidated by it. So storytelling, particularly this kind of storytelling, really, it's just about pulling memories and giving them enough context so that your audience can feel that memory with you. You don't necessarily have to be, if you don't feel like you're particularly creative or you're not a strong performer or something like that, I don't know necessarily that you need all of those stage skills in order to do this. It's really about finding that way to connect with an audience. I think storytelling is powerful for a lot of reasons, but one of the most powerful reasons is that so often audience members sitting there listening to a story will hear something that resonates with them and will realize that they're not the only person who feels that way. And that's really the ultimate goal of storytelling. And so don't worry about all the trappings of it, right? Don't worry about necessarily all the performance aspects of it. If you have an audience that you think is going to be receptive to it, if you have a group of people who are excited about sharing some aspect of their lives, just go for it.
Well, I want to thank you, Becca, so much for sharing all that information about storytelling and really about owning voices and your own narrative. And I just thank you so much for giving us all that information. I think that it'll be something that I think our listeners can take away, whether they're in a classroom or in a community job where they can kind of run these initiatives. I could definitely see this taking off and being something that people try to implement.
I hope so. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me and letting me share.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Assembling Inclusion podcast. I hope the information in this episode taught you something new, gave you a new idea, or showcased a new perspective. If you liked the episode, feel free to leave us a review or comment. If you have a recommendation for an individual or an organization who would make a great guest, you can message us on Twitter or Instagram, or send us an email at assemblinginclusion@gmail.com. See you next time.